Welcome to the Syria Spectrum, bringing you policy through perspectives. I'm your host, Sami Akil. Syria's decade-long conflict has long been shaped by an array of international actors. But one player has consistently operated in the background, quietly influencing outcomes without deploying troops or taking center stage in the diplomatic arenas when it came to Syria. That actor being China. Today's episode explores why China matters to Syria's future, especially in the post-Assad transition, and how Beijing's long-term strategy is shaping the next phase of reconstruction and diplomacy. But let's start with the basics first. Syria and China established ties really early. Damascus was one of the first Arab states to recognize the People's Republic of China in 1956. While relations initially cooled as Syria fell into Moscow's orbit during the Cold War, they grew again in the 1990s and were accelerated after Bashar al-Assad's rise to power in 2000. China became a political partner, a growing economic presence through companies like Huawei and Haier, and a quiet supplier of limited military technology. When the Syrian conflict erupted, China adopted a predictable but strategic posture that was centered around four major cornerstones. First, it opposed regime change. Second, it rejected external intervention. Third, it protected its interests through UN veto power. And fourth, it managed the threat of Uighur militias as well as Central Asian foreign fighters embodied in Syrian jihadist groups. China saw the Assad regime, despite all of its brutality, as a more stable alternative to state collapse or Western-led intervention. Beijing vetoed multiple UN Security Council resolutions targeting Damascus, citing non-interference and the lessons it drew from NATO's Libya intervention. However, at the same time, China remained cautious, avoiding major reconstruction investments until a durable political settlement emerged. After Assad's fall in 2024, China was thrust into a new political reality. Today, a year later, Beijing continues to calibrate its approach. Amid all of this, two schools of thought have emerged in China vis-a-vis Beijing's foreign policy towards Syria. The idealists, who insist that Syria must fully address the threat of Uyghur foreign fighters before engagement deepens, while the pragmatists, who argue that the regional environment has shifted and that China risks being sidelined as Gulf states, Turkey, and Western donors continue to re-engage. At the time of this recording, it appears that the pragmatists are gaining ground. There have been repeated diplomatic contacts, quiet negotiations, and growing indications that a framework of cooperation may emerge, one that would eventually bring Chinese companies back into Syria's reconstruction centers, from infrastructure to energy and housing. A key sign of progress, Syria's foreign minister, Assad al-Shaybani, is expected to visit Beijing, though the exact date has not yet been confirmed. If this meeting does take place, it would signal that negotiations have reached a baseline understanding and are moving into a more formal phase. To help us answer this question and analyze Sino-Syrian relations in post-Assad Syria, I'm joined by Jesse Marks. Jesse is the CEO and Managing Director of Rihla Research and Advisory, a consultancy and private think tank that provides research, strategic advisory, and thought leadership on the forces shaping global politics with a particular expertise in China, the Middle East, and Asia. Jesse is a leading analyst in China's engagement in the MENA region and has written extensively on Beijing's shifting posture towards Syria. Jesse, welcome to the Syria Spectrum. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
So Jesse, just to help us understand the fundamentals, can you maybe set the scene on how we got here today and what does Beijing actually want from Syria, both in terms of strategic outlook, economic investments, and broader sense of security today?
Certainly. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's certainly a timely topic. To start off, I think the Chinese have been very clear. They've outlined three clear priorities, which I think is important to lay out at the top because it creates a distinction between rhetoric and actual practice. But first and foremost, whenever you ask or you read a statement from a Chinese official, it's always three things. One, respect for Syrian sovereignty and territorial integrity. Basic subline is no regime change. Two, a Syrian-led inclusive political process aligned with Resolution 2254 that is also meaningful to the Syrian people. And finally, the one we'll be spending a lot of time in today, most likely, is a firm counterterrorism framework that addresses Beijing's concerns around foreign fighters, particularly ETIM and TIP, the groups that it perceives to be the largest threat to its own domestic security. But when we really talk about what China wants, I think the honest place is, sadly enough, to go back to 2011. I will not bore you with the long history of this, but I think there's a couple of moments which really highlight China's core logic towards Syria, and that really begins with Libya. When the Chinese government abstained on a vote within the UN Security Council for intervention in Libya, it did not expect the Libyan regime to collapse as quickly as it did. And what mattered for China was the principle that it had opted to push against regime change, but in reality, its abstention led to one. And in practice, China had to evacuate more than 30,000 people with almost no capacity or military infrastructure in the region. And that did quite a lot of damage to the Chinese psyche, to the Chinese civil service, and to Xi Jinping himself, who was to assume leadership just a year or two later. But Syria became the country where Xi Jinping drew a hard line on regime change. Under Xi, China was determined that Syria would not be another Libya, and over a decade, all of its diplomacy bent toward that specific outcome. In practice, that meant shielding Assad at the UN, bargaining with Russia and the United States over cross-border aid, and ultimately treating Syria as a place where China could prove the value of its sovereignty first worldview, and ensuring Assad remained in power. Then, in December, everything changed. Right? China built its entire Syria policy on the assumption that China would endure. But when HTS and opposition forces pushed into Damascus in December, Beijing was caught off balance. Even as regime forces were collapsing along the M5, right? As HTS is pushing from Hama to Homs, China's UN ambassador was still publicly calling at the UN Security Council for member states to support Assad's defense. Beijing did not prepare for the reality or the eventuality that an internal revolution would ultimately succeed. And suddenly it was confronted with a Syria that it did not plan for. And what followed was a very pragmatic adjustment on Syria's part. It had to engage with the groups that it previously called terrorists. That is a pretty massive shift in terms of a diplomatic position. But within weeks, they reopened direct channels with President Shara and the Foreign Minister Shaybani to establish a new baseline of expectations across the board. What was unique was inside of Beijing, you kind of saw two camps emerge. You had the idealists, and these were the core group of people that argue that China should not engage with Syria's new government until they meet Beijing's expectations around what the Syrian authorities' relationship with ETIM and TIP groups that, again, China considers terrorist actors, about what that relationship would be. And in their mind, China can simply wait. It has the ability to wait and maintain support for UN sanctions and ultimately force Damascus to bend in negotiations. On the other side are a group that I like to call the pragmatists, and these are the folks who look at China's engagement with the Taliban and see that as a baseline for how China could engage with Syria's policy in the long term. They generally see China's approach right now with Syria as a bit outdated and not relevant to the new Middle Eastern architecture that's evolving. In practice, they believe China needs to engage with Syria directly and shape a practical understanding of what a relationship with Syria around counterterrorism and foreign fighters should look like, and ultimately engage in reconstruction and use investment infrastructure to play a long-term stabilizing role in Syria. And in practice, they're open to localized solutions on how to respond to the foreign fighter issue, like naturalization, giving them Syrian citizenship, controlling their movements inside of the country, internal monitoring, all the things that were discussed in the context initially with the Taliban. So they see value also, I think, which is quite important for later in this conversation, but aligning more closely with the GCC as Syria stabilizes. But even with those differences between the camps, the core concerns are the same: security and predictability around the question of counterterrorism. And ultimately, if there's a breakthrough in that process, there's a potential for long-term Chinese economic investment. But a big piece of that is there already was some degree of economic investment, but much of the Chinese money that went into Damascus has been frozen since Assad fell. So there's another conversation around kind of restoring or renegotiating the rights of Chinese companies that have already invested in Syria.
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
That's great. Very comprehensive, Jesse. So do you think that there are prerequisites basically along the lines of security and predictability, as you mentioned, for any future economic investments to happen? Or do you think that any closer engagement could happen in the near future? I mean, we saw now China abstain in the recent UN Security Council resolution pertaining the removal of Shara and Anas Khattab from the terrorist designations. Do you see that the pragmatist win basically is gaining traction?
Certainly. When looking into kind of the foreign policy window in Beijing, it seems that the pragmatists are winning out in the conversation. The UN Security Council resolution was a unique shift because moving into the resolution debate, there were kind of two potential outcomes that could have emerged. The first was that Syria and China reach a deal via negotiations before a resolution was tabled. That was the ideal outcome to avoid a situation for the second outcome, which is where China is forced to abstain because it will not vote against the UN Security Council consensus. There was an ongoing conversation previously where people were speculating whether Russia would ultimately support lifting sanctions on President Bashar or whether they would vote along with China and ultimately veto the resolution. But based on the outcome last week, it seems that China was actually begrudgingly voting to abstain because it did not want to be seen as the one breaking consensus. And the Chinese UN representative was quite forceful in his words that they regretted how the resolution was carried out and expressed frustration with the US in forcing the resolution through. So the outcome, I think that the ideal outcome, which was a negotiated agreement prior to the resolution, ultimately did not happen. And that could actually transform how Foreign Minister Shaibani's visit to China later this month is likely to go. There were signs that there was a breakthrough given that the dialogue there's been a two-form dialogue, one happening in Damascus and one happening in the UN, and both were moving concurrent. And the dialogue at the working level in Damascus seemed to have made several breakthroughs. The signal of that is that Shaibani was planning to go to Beijing to have further conversations. Like that typically is a good sign when you're dealing in Chinese foreign policy and mediation. However, it is yet to be seen how the UN resolution is going to change that calculus. If Foreign Minister Shaibani does go, that is still a good sign that negotiations are on track and that it did not fully deviate from the pathway that they've been on. But ultimately, the big thing that we're looking for is whether President Bashar will visit on that trip as well.
Certainly, and I think that's a great segue with the upcoming ministerial visit with Foreign Minister Shaibani visiting Beijing later this month. What do you think that the Syrian government's priorities are when it comes to engaging to Beijing? Is it primarily sanctions relief? Obviously, reconstruction financing is the big ticket item, one could assume, and maybe to some extent political recognition. But do you think that there is something more long-term that the Syrian side or the current interim government in Syria is looking to gain out of this relationship in Beijing, with Beijing, sorry?
I think it was twofold, right? They really got what they wanted in the first one, probably just not in the way that they had hoped to get it, which was, Syria needed China to abstain for their resolution lifting sanctions on President Bashar. They got the abstention. Like as I mentioned, it was reluctant, and China made a point of signaling its frustration with how that process went. And on the outside of it, they made it clear after the resolution that its vote was indeed, very much so pragmatic, that they do want to see Syria recover, but that recovery would ultimately only occur under conditions of stability and stronger counterterrorism cooperation. Like they continued to hammer down the point around ETIM, ETIM, and TIP, and kind of the foreign fighter piece. You mentioned, correctly, the second priority is economic, and this is where things become quite a bit more complicated. Is there's unlikely to be any major shift on the economic reconstruction conversation until there's a solution to the counterterrorism conversation. If you look at post-conflict situations, in most cases, Chinese firms and Chinese money is the first to really enter into post-conflict environments, and that's typically a sign that reconstruction has begun in terms of foreign investment. But until now, no major Chinese funds have actually moved into Syria to actually scale up investment and begin doing business. And I think that's beyond a few independent Chinese entrepreneurs, most of whom are actually entering the market from the Gulf. We're not seeing that kind of first mover occurrence. So I think as they're going to Beijing, on the topic will be, first and foremost, getting to a baseline understanding regarding what China's expectations are for Syria, but those expectations have been laid out. I think there's a broader security argument and conversation that has to happen around exactly what those communities that China wants to see managed mean to the current Syrian government, given they participated in the battles in Homs and Hama. They were the tip of the spear into Damascus. Like they played a role in the revolution. And the Syrian authorities cannot so easily give up a community, at least from the perception of Syrian authorities, that they cannot give up a community that was loyal at a time where parts of its support base are breaking off, because the Syrian president and authorities have had to balance its original support base with kind of what looks externally as liberalization and engaging with the U.S. and others. So I think this understanding of that community is difficult to bridge, and they'll have to come to terms in Damascus. I mean, sorry, in Beijing, and I think that's not an easy conversation. You know, from folks I've spoken with, the pragmatists have won out, and that kind of the hardline positions that China had initially began with in the negotiations had softened, and that there actually had been some progress in developing an understanding of what potential solutions could look like, and those look like what China has done in Afghanistan. So there's a whole case study and academic policy work on, you know, comparing the Afghanistan approach to Syria. But again, it's difficult to fully see through the cracks of that negotiation right now. But you know, people that I've engaged with in Beijing seem to have a degree of hope that things are moving in the right direction. That doesn't mean they're going to arrive in the right direction, but they are moving in the right direction.
Great. So, obviously, you mentioned the that the security question needs to be resolved first and foremost when it comes to the file of foreign fighters from Xinjiang and other Uyghur minorities. Do you think that, or how do you think is the best way to resolve this file that is acceptable from a Chinese perspective, apart from giving them citizenship? Because from an outsider perspective, this kind of appears as a quick fix rather than a long-term solution. So what would be the ideal scenario for China to resolve this file, and what are the main obstacles to achieve that ideal scenario that would eventually, as you noted, potentially lead to a deeper engagement with the Syrian state?
I mean, I think that's the million-dollar question right now. I think if the Chinese take a more pragmatic approach to it, there's an understanding that they're not going to get their kind of first request. Um, in other words, those communities will remain in Syria. Then the next step is, okay, if those communities, if there's an agreement that if China has consented to those communities basically staying in Syria, and the Syrian government basically saying, okay, fine, we will work with you on ways to ensure that they do not present a threat to you long term or to your interests and people in Syria, which is really the big question and concern. I think that's been on the table when you look at the UN counterterrorism committee's meeting minutes, right? The Chinese have accused the Uyghurs of participating in kidnapping and harassment of its officials. Like, this is still the big sticking piece. They're not confident that the Syrian authorities have either A, the will, or B, the capacity. And I think the second one is where they're more leaning on right now, is the capacity to manage these communities and ensure that they are not going to be a long-term threat to Chinese interests, either in Syria, in the region, or back in Beijing. So, I mean, the solutions are really going to flow from that. I believe it was in Afghanistan, there was a proposal basically to keep them into one geographic area and to limit their mobility to within like city limits of specific areas. Maybe that's one option. The other right is citizenship and basically naturalization and integration into Syria. Typically, the argument goes that this community has been in Syria for a long time. Many of them married Syrian. Some of them speak Arabic, some of them don't. It's really hard to assess the level of truth to that. But Syria has a long history of integrating communities, right? When you look at the Circassian community, when you look at Armenian, you can pick so many different communities in history, and Syria has always had the ability to absorb communities and I don't want to call them shamize them, but give them this distinctive Syrian identity. I remember when I was running around in Eastern Homs meeting with Rukban returnees, we ended up at a hospital. And I saw, ginger to the core fighter, holding a gun, guarding the hospital entrance. And I was like, are you Irish, Scottish? Like, but it's really interesting just seeing,
Yeah.
just the general type of diversity that exists in Syria. So I think there is a degree of truth to that conversation, and the naturalization conversation kind of flows from Syria's history of being able to do that. But the real question, that China is going to want to know is, how is the Ministry of Defense, how are the internal security forces going to ensure that these groups do not pick up arms again or have the ability to plan and process? The difficulty for that is they've been integrated, at least parts of them have been integrated into the military. Generally, the U.S. and others that I've spoken with tend to, make the argument and the claim that no, they're loyal to the new regime, and their participation in the defense forces creates a more rigid command and control structure that allows the Syrian military to kind of govern and dominate their actions and restrict their flow, and if needed, have a judicial mechanism to punish and to enforce. Kind of more rigorous control over the community and ensure that they're demobilized. But right, they're also training, and I believe they're an elite unit, or aspects of them are an elite unit, which means they get more specialized training, which definitely doesn't sit well with China.
Yeah.
Um,
They've also
because
been providing this training, some
yeah.
components of them as well, or personal
So
trainers, basically in military combat.
yeah, so it really is it's a trust game, right? Can the Syrian government, I should say, deliver on kind of a framework of control which satisfies China's concerns and ultimately this deep, I would say, inherent insecurity, which is not just on the Syria question, but you see play out kind of across Chinese politics with Xinjiang and other places. And it's not unique to Syria, but I think Syria is unique in that they became a part of the governing institution. And that China's position, per se, with Syria is quite different than its relationship with the Taliban, post-Afghanistan was, right? Because they woke up one day and realized that the Syria that they were trying to avoid became the leadership structure they then had to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, to some extent, right, you have to give it to them that they have dutifully engaged on this question. They did not just close the door and say, we're done. But they saw, a degree of pragmatic engagement as necessary, even if they have not reached that baseline. So I think this is, I don't have a clear answer on what the best solution is in that specific case. It's really going to come down to kind of a calculated conversation on the Syrian side about how far they can go on the Syrian side to maintain and control that population, to get as close to China's kind of position as possible. And to the extent that the pragmatist communities in Beijing will be able to convince Chinese authorities that engaging long-term in Syria's future is more important than drawing a red line in the sand right now. And I think that's where the conversation on the Beijing side gets interesting, because Gulf countries, the US, the EU, even Russia have all accepted this consensus that whether you like it or not, the Syrian authorities are there, Shara is there, and his role in the country is going to be fixed, at least for the near to midterm. And that if you choose to not embrace that reality or accept that reality, no matter how bitter it is, then you're going to eventually lose your ability to play a role in that process.
I think there's a lot to unpack there, and obviously it will be interesting to see how the security sector reform file will evolve in Syria in the years to come. But I just want to touch upon something you mentioned earlier vis-a-vis, Chinese investment in Syria. You mentioned that obviously most of the investments that have occurred so far, albeit very limited, have originated mostly from private businessmen or Chinese businessmen based in the Gulf. So obviously Gulf states have moved quickly to sign plenty of MOUs with the Syrian state since the December toppling of Assad. And obviously yesterday, or at the time of this recording, Dubai Ports has officially taken control of one of the main ports in Syria now. I believe it was Tartus, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. How do you see that China's role fit into this? Does it see the competition from the Gulf when it comes to Syria, or is Syria just another drop in the sand when it comes to engagement in the Levant, access to the Mediterranean, the Belt and Road Initiative? How relevant is Syria when it comes to these files, in your perspective?
I think it depends on who you ask.
Yeah.
I think it depends on who you ask. I tend to find a split in the communities that I speak with, right? In Beijing, you do have this kind of deference and separation from the Syria portfolio, right? For the entirety of the war, for the most part, Syria has not been important to China on terms of economic reconstruction, investment, development, even BRI, right? They were a very late joiner to BRI. It's always been a normative thing, right? China wanted to draw a line in the sand and say, we will not allow the West to, create the implications or the kind of conditions for regime change. So I think framing Syria in that point is that really hasn't changed significantly within the framework of kind of Chinese foreign policy, because ultimately that their process wasn't successful in the end, right? The revolution internally ended up doing what China was trying to prevent externally. But that said, I think the perception in the Gulf, where you have a considerable amount of Chinese capital and wealth is a bit different. I think they do see value. They do see Syria, particularly within the framework of a Gulf investment framework, right? They do see their involvement more framed around Gulf capital and kind of Gulf, I would say like normative and procedural engagement and helping create the environment for investment. And I think that's where we're going to see the first wave of Chinese investment, potentially even before there's a deal. But that's not necessarily competing with or trying to outshine the Gulf, right? It's emerging from within the Gulf. But then if we like step back at a 1,000-foot level, the international investment environment in Syria is still relatively stagnant, right? You now have a sovereign wealth fund, you have a development fund. These are very new in the last 6 months. Like it's going to take time to build kind of the priorities, the frameworks, and the infrastructure necessary to be able to mint, legitimate multi-$100 million, billion-dollar deals. So, with all of the tens of billions, I think we're like 27 billion, forget the exact amount. It changes almost daily at this point. That's been committed to Syria. We're not actually seeing, commitments and MOUs transition into physical reconstruction. And where we have, right, most of these deals are based in energy deals or real estate. They're not trickling down to the type of infrastructure that actually is needed in Syria to stabilize the country. In February and in June, I did 2 different road trips, doing meetings with displaced communities and basically up to Idlib, all the way down the western spine, and then in June east over toward Qaryatain and toward Palmyra to Tadmor to see and understand and talk to people about what the challenges are and the devastation in the countryside, right? The lack of water, just the number of electrical lines that are still dangling in the wind. This is where investment really has to kick in to ensure that the countryside, not just the cities, can also rebuild and develop. Simple things like, there was it was when I was crossing the border from Jordan to Syria, there's miles and miles of cement trucks and hilariously Korean cars, but cement trucks trying to enter into places like Daraa to basically rebuild because those areas were neglected. Even though they shifted hands to Assad, Assad did nothing to actually rebuild them. The reason I draw that distinction is in most cases where you've seen post-conflict reconstruction and you saw these first mover Chinese companies move in, they invest in that core stuff, right? So they're looking to build cement factories. They're looking to build things like, potentially solar generation. Like they're looking at finding ways, yes, to get quick returns from a post-conflict reconstruction market, but there is a focus on building core infrastructure. And what we have not seen in Syria's reconstruction kind of portfolio of investments that people are announcing is that specific focus. Who's going to rebuild roads? Who's going to put water stations back operationally? Who's going to reconnect the wires? Like who's going to do the hard, dirty, and often expensive work with very few returns to get this stuff stood up. In most cases, bravo to them, it's Syrians themselves. I remember going to Marat Numan in February, just 2 months after, and they had one electricity generator and one power pole attached to that. And there were 500 families had returned. And they were expecting that number to shoot up to, 30, 40,000 people within 3 to 6 months. They're brick by brick, home by home, demining, putting in cement foundation, rebuilding, demolishing, rebuilding, putting power lines together. It's like Syrians themselves are doing this work. So I don't see Gulf money doing that. And I draw the distinction because maybe this first wave of Chinese entrepreneurs in the Gulf will bring some of that money. I think we may hear in the next couple of months of maybe 1, 2, 3 types of companies coming in and doing either public-private partnerships over things like cement factories. I do think we're going to see more of that type of news pop up. But again, these are Chinese investors in the Gulf.
Exactly. So those would be basically private investors, not something that is basically being advocated for from Beijing per se.
Exactly. And I think that's the big piece, is the big whales that particularly. So Chinese SOEs and then Chinese major development banks are not moving into Syria right now. And I think that's going to be the evidence of when we see kind of the hinge begin to move in favor of an open door, right? We will potentially see more of those firms coming to China because basically Chinese entrepreneurs come often. I was speaking with folks in Damascus the other day and they're like, we speak with Chinese investors and entrepreneurs coming in, looking at doing everything from setting up EV factories to, infrastructure projects. But a lot of them are independent. They're smaller firms. They're, maybe joint investments, joint ventures like those. There's been 1 or 2 that I've heard of that are looking at potentially doing business, but those are based in Dubai, Abu Dhabi. So it's a really unique environment when talking about Chinese investment. But I think the one unique aspect of this is that Chinese money flowing into Syria will most likely flow through a Gulf framework. So even though the Gulf may not be doing a lot of that kind of work, the investment that they're putting in, the time and kind of regulatory investment to building the institutions will actually create a more productive environment for Chinese entrepreneurs to go into that first wave. The other piece of this, though, speaking with the CEO in the UAE about 2 weeks ago, and he made a really interesting point, which is the first wave is good to get things stood up, but realistically, most of the money that enters into a market happens when the Chinese government enters in and establishes a more clear framework in the political layer, right? So the political agreement with the host government of what Chinese investment will look like. That political layer is very far from being established in Syria. I mean, if you even look at the Chinese embassy, all of their staff are still in Beirut. They don't even go back and live overnight in Syria. So that's a good, I think, that's a good barometer of where the relationship is they don't even trust security conditions overnight. Granted, neither do the US. So you don't see, US thing overnight either. They're either in Turkey or Amman. So I don't necessarily think it's a negative thing, but generally, you're not seeing that real push on China's side to move those whales into reconstruction. It doesn't mean they won't, but I think the likely thing is if the government won't create that political layer, the Gulf may. And if the Gulf can create that political layer, then the money can still come in.
Great stuff. So obviously, you touched upon the U.S., and I think the U.S. and Syria have been quite a bit in the headlines over the past couple of days. Obviously, President Bashar was in the White House, the first historic visit of a Syrian head of state to enter the White House. How does this basically fit into Beijing's calculus? How does it see this greater engagement between Washington and Damascus, particularly maybe when it comes to like the security file? There has been also the rumors that there might be some sort of airbase leased, rented in Damascus. How does this fit into the calculus of Beijing? Especially that, I mean, realistically speaking, I don't think the Syrian Air Force will be supplied by F-35s anytime soon. And obviously, the Syrians are in dire need for military equipment. And if the Russians might not be willing to provide that, would the Chinese potentially be a potential avenue for that? So basically, how do you see this greater U.S. engagement impact Chinese-Syrian relations, particularly from the security perspective?
No, yeah, I think that's kind of a critical question here to think about specifically. I'll try to break it down into a couple pieces. I think generally, China's not necessarily being pushed by the US process, right? Like they were very frustrated. You could see on the back end of the UN debate saying, you're forcing through a solution before we've done the hard work of actually figuring out whether the situation and environment inside is stable. There is truth to that conversation in the sense that, from the Chinese perspective, right, they don't believe their concerns have been listened to or heeded by the U.S., but uniquely even by the Russians, right? Like the Russians equally voted in this, and that created the conditions that are quite frustrating for Chinese authorities. I think, though, for them, they're content to wait. They don't need to move in, even if the U.S. is advancing forward. I think it's understood that the Syrian government is moving in the direction of the U.S., but I think from the Chinese side, they also understand that the U.S. is not involved in Syria beyond security at this point. I think they understand that kind of Trump's movement on this is really linked to Syria's closest partner and ally, which is the Gulf. And that offers a level of reassurance that there is still a reliable partner that is not the U.S. that can be engaged with bilaterally on Syria, and if necessary, trilaterally, meaning a potential mediator, if there is no breakthrough, that understands China's concerns and to some extent shares them. So I think, from this end, like there is certainly an incongruence between how a lot of the great powers think about Syria. There's an agreement. They want a stable Syria. They want a unified Syria. They want a Syria that's not going to be used as a platform for terrorism. There's a strong understanding across that. But the timeline of kind of creating the space for Syria to recover in the near term is running up against expectations of what Syria will be able to do in the long term with counterterrorism. And I think that is a split that the US and China have not fully reconciled. But really, I think the fundamental difference is that I don't necessarily think that the other Security Council members recognize China's concern about the Uyghurs as legitimate. And when you look at the meeting minutes from the UN Sanctions Committee, and I flag that, and for listeners, I highly encourage you to go read them. They're fascinating when they talk about the role of Tim, and TIP in Syria, and the foreign fighter issue, because there's a clear split between council members. You'll have one council member, unnamed because they can't attribute, talking about how these groups have continued to threaten Chinese nationals across the country. Mm-hmm. And then you'll have another council member did not share this assessment, and noted that their allegiance is strong with the Syrian government. So like there's clues that there's also disagreements about how seriously this request and this specific push by China should be taken. So I think on the US side, they're content to kind of let China fall off the wayside. Be like, if you don't want to have a role in Syria, don't have a role in Syria. But the key point of relevance for China is reconstruction, right? Who's going to do the hard work to rebuild the like rural and local areas, the places like that's still the piece that I think both the US, Syria, the Gulf, China, and the EU still have to figure out. It's because Grand Towers in Damascus and rebuilding the Sheraton are great and they're fine and they help kind of with this new trend of tourism going to Syria. They don't actually help, Ahmad living in Qaryatain or, Noura living in rural homes or in, Halab in a town that's 80% mined and destroyed, rebuild her life. And I think that is where investment really has to kick in. And historically, that's typically where US money and assistance has been really good at deploying local capital, like basically hiring and bringing in Syrian civil society and these others. The difficulty is that the US gutted all of that assistance and earlier this year when the Trump administration came in. So the destruction of USAID, I cannot explain and express, having been in Syria when it was occurring, was horrific. Like across Syria, people were impacted within, in some cases, minutes, hours, and days, because as funding was cut, basically budgets ran out and people realized that they couldn't get water pumped anymore because no one was paying for it. Yeah. So I think that local level of understanding for China doesn't yet exist, and for the US is no longer appreciated. And the Gulf, I think, is somewhere between those things. On the defense side, which I think is actually really quite interesting, as you highlighted, really comes down to two things. One, what is the long-term US presence in Syria? And two, as the Syrian government looks to rebuild its military, what does that look like? What platforms does it pick? What acquisition networks does it use? And which region, to borrow the term, does it want to kind of park its military in? I think starting with the first question, I'm not convinced that the US is convinced in itself that it wants to stay in Syria, right? Trump has constantly argued and advocated that it wants to withdraw US forces, often because he didn't want, during his administration, US bloodshed in Syria. It didn't want soldiers dying. Often that was linked to the question of Iran, Iran proxies that were threatening and willing to retaliate against, any form of conflict, whether that was bilateral with Israel or with the US. That calculus has changed, and now we're exploring the deployment of more forces, the introduction of new bases. So seemingly that shifted, but even within Trump's own administration, there's never been coherence on the long-term posture in Syria, right? You saw the removal of Joel Rayburn, who is the former envoy, and he was appointed to be the assistant secretary. They withdrew his nomination. Because he was initially part of the, because he was initially, people accused him of being a part of the camp that saw any form of normalization with the Bashar government as unnecessary, and they wanted to maintain U.S. sanctions. So that environment in the administration is fascinating to observe in itself, because it does actually insinuate that there may be a long-term U.S. presence in Syria in general, which kind of gives Syria this kind of Djibouti-like status, because now you have the Russians, the Israelis, the Syrians, the Turks, the Americans. Like, it just becomes this unique ecosystem. On the question of rebuilding, it's fascinating because Syria's capabilities overwhelmingly have been Russian for the last 15 years, right?
Correct. Yeah.
So if the MOD
Soviet,
wants to, even Soviet, yeah, even older. But like if they want to maintain the existing assets that they have, right, that means seeking sustainment packages from Russia to keep their systems running. But they have other options, right? Turkey has offered defense ties. That means potential access to Turkish drones and other Turkish systems and access. Not bad, right? Turkey's not sanctionable on the US side. Russia is CAATSA sanctionable. Like if they do extend that platform a bit more, then it may fall under CAATSA sanctions, which basically restrict US from providing defense assistance to countries who purchase Russian military equipment. So sometimes countries can get a waiver for that. Like I believe India has a waiver. I believe there's one other country that has a waiver. I think it was Egypt.
I was going to say Egypt, I think, as well.
But Syria runs the risk of falling into that trap. Mm-hmm. China may be one potential source of defense equipment. I'm not talking like massive systems, but munitions, weapons, like smaller weapons, small arms, these types of things they may explore. I think that would generally be a red line for the U.S. There are maybe some small things that they may be able to buy from Chinese private sector. But I think generally for the US, where the real red line will be with Chinese kind of role in the defense architecture will be tech and telecom, right? If Huawei comes in and tries to set up a 5G network or push a deal with Damascus on 5G or other critical infrastructure for clothesline comms, so the types of classified conversations that the US will be having with the Syrians on de-ISIS work, I think that's a red line. But previously, most countries in the region didn't have an alternative if they wanted 5G. It was Huawei. But now, the technology's caught up. You've got Gulf companies. I think Zain is looking at it. Etisalat is potentially on the line to invest. There are alternatives, right? If they choose to go with China, that's an active choice. It's not that there aren't alternatives in the market. The other one, I think the dark horse to be looking at, though, in terms of defense equipment, are broader Asia. Like I think Korea, it's like South Korea, is uniquely tied with Syria. They were the first Asian countries to normalize. It was actually the last country for them to normalize relations. The only country now they don't have diplomatic relations with is North Korea, which is fascinating.
Correct. Yeah. That relationship basically switched from north to south within 24 hours. It was very fascinating to see.
And when you look at when you go in and look at kind of the Korean think tank communities talking about their strategic shift, it's fascinating because there was a conscious process of like, okay, not only can we play a good economic and reconstruction role, we can also be a potential defense partner and like a security coordination, security cooperation, these kinds of things. So I think that's an interesting one to watch play out long term, just because the Korean arms market in the Middle East has rapidly expanded.
Yeah.
So I don't think, to borrow the Gen Z term, that Syria will sleep on that opportunity.
Yeah.
So I think, but from a bilateral piece, I think the U.S. will be quite clear with Syria that Chinese equipment and technology will be a no-go for the defense relationship. But again, the key point here is Syria is still a registered state-sponsored terrorism. So the level or degree of U.S. defense equipment that they can get in the near term is virtually nothing until there is until it's lifted. Right, but I think that's going to be linked long term to the future of Caesar, and that's a whole other piece of this picture. But I don't think the U.S. will look kindly on Syria purchasing Chinese equipment in mass.
That is to be expected. So basically, just to wrap things up now, and I think we've touched upon several points, but just for the policymakers who are tuning in and who would like to get a better understanding of China's interests and engagement with Syria. What are the key things to look out for over the next couple of months? What do you mean? What do you think are the key indicators that a genuine China-Syria relationship is beginning to take shape? What's your perspective on that?
I think that's a great question. I will try to answer it. I think there's a lot of different indicators, but I think a lot of them you have to look a little bit between the lines. I don't think you should expect them to reach any level of, use the term, partnership yet, right? Except in maybe some very niche, narrow areas of cooperation. I think it's more likely, as you're observing the relationship, that the next phase of talks, if successful, will open up some form of agreement or understanding. And based on that understanding, like the one between the Taliban and Chinese officials, over how to manage the foreign fighter issue and manage security coordination, that you will begin to see a shift in tone at the UN, which I think is really the signaling point, because you don't actually see much beyond the general type of statement coming out from Damascus and from the Chinese embassy to Syria. So you really have to look at the UN. I think it'll be a structured shift in how that conversation is carried out and how Chinese officials refer to Syria and speak about the Syrian authorities. We've seen that as there's been progress in Damascus, we've seen a softer tone on Syrian authorities, except with the reminder that they have, international obligations to counterterrorism and all these things. But they, if you look at what they've said so far as a signal, right? They defended Syria's right to territorial integrity and sovereignty when the Israelis invaded in the south. They condemned Israeli strikes inside of Syria, including on the MOD. So they have thrown bones in the sense that they have created a breadcrumb trail to show their position has changed over time, and they're more willing to support certain claims that Syria, by nature of being a state, has. I think the real sign, though, is going to be, there's two, actually. One, if President Bashar goes to Beijing, it's going to mean that we've kind of reached the ceiling on this multi-floor dialogue, right? Foreign minister level engagement, in Damascus is a big sign of progress, right? Before we saw China brokering Iran and Saudi Arabia, we saw shuttle diplomacy between the foreign ministers. That's typically a good sign that mediation is working. But a state level visit will be a strong sign of nearing or even potentially an already reached understanding of what's coming next. But I think truly the most evident and big clue to be watching for are Chinese state backed banks, SOEs in Syria entering into the market. When you see those deals move forward, it means that Chinese companies have at least a tacit approval to move forward with doing business in Damascus. And that would also signal that there's a the perceived risk to Chinese nationals has somewhat been alleviated, or at least there's more trust that the environment in Syria is safer to do business as a Chinese national. And ultimately that, Chinese insecurity over the foreign fighter issue has at least been alleviated enough that, Chinese companies feel that by going into doing business that, they're not going to be kicked out the next day or that they're not going to have attacks against their infrastructure. So I think that's really like that trickle down effect of, okay, big companies going in, what does that mean all the way down to the Chinese worker who's going to work in one of those factories? So that's the signal that the situation is improving. Or they could just make it easy for all of us and put out a statement saying, "Ta-da! We solved all of our problems, guys." I don't think that will happen after the next meeting, but I'm relatively bullish on kind of the progress they've made. Again, the one spoiler is this vote going through without an agreement established beforehand in the UN Security Council. That could potentially throw it off, or at least make Foreign Minister Shahbani's visit a little bit more uncomfortable than it probably already would be.
Well, lots to look out for. I think it will be interesting to see how that visit takes shape and how it develops, and if there is going to be any tangible outcomes. I think, as you said, it's the first step in the right direction, but it will definitely not be followed by a statement saying that all issues have been resolved. I think it's more of a long-term thing. So Jesse, thank you very much for your time today. Really, really thoughtful insights, and I think there's a lot to unpack in the months to come. Definitely, we're seeing more broader Asian engagement or broader Syrian engagement with Asia as Syria begins to also diversify its relations. So we'll be delighted to have you again with us in the next couple of months if the opportunity arises. So thank you very much, Jesse, once again for your time. I appreciate it a lot.
Thank you for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure. I always enjoy getting to talk this conversation with people who are dedicated to kind of having a broader conversation beyond just kind of what's happening around the mainstream. Because I think this is going to be a long-term critical aspect of Syria's future. It has been already. So thank you for the opportunity to join you all. And yeah, it's been fantastic.
Thank you very much, Jesse. That was Jesse Marks, CEO and Managing Director of Rihla Research and Advisory, bringing nuanced analysis on China's evolving posture towards Syria and what it means for the country's economic, political, and security trajectory. Be sure to check out Rihla's China-Syria political tracker for deeper insights and up-to-date monitoring of Beijing's engagement in Syria. As a reminder, the views and opinions expressed in this episode are those of the guest and do not necessarily reflect the positions of the Syria Spectrum, the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, or the Change for Syria Network. A sincere thank you for our outstanding production and research team for the dedicated research and analysis in preparation for this episode. The Syria Spectrum podcast is produced with the support of the Tahrir Institute and in partnership with the Change for Syria Network. I'm your host, Sami Akil, and this is the Syria Spectrum. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next episode.